I'm Dr. Alix Dietzel, and I'm a climate change policy and climate justice scholar. I work at the University of Bristol at SPACE, and my main focus in my research is to figure out how just the response to climate change is, whether we're making fair and good decisions. And I study climate policy all the way from the global level down to the local level in Bristol.
Hi, my name is Zakiya Mackenzie. I am a Bristol Black and Green Ambassador and currently a nature writer as well. Black and Green program, we are a group that kind of advocates for more Black voices, more Asian and minority voices in the conversations that we have that instruct policy on what happens with the environment.
That's great. So it's really nice to speak with you today. I wondered whether you could tell me a bit more about your work and what it focuses on.
I am what's called a Black and Green Ambassador in Bristol, or I went through a program called the Black and Green Ambassadorship Program. I'm now an alumni of the program. And Black and Green came about in response to the 2015 Green Capital year, where Bristol was, Green Capital of Europe. From Ujima Radio, which is the volunteer organization that I was a part of, decided to highlight diverse communities and the activities that they have been doing, that we have been doing in terms of environmental sustainability, and also talking about long traditions. So not just things in response to climate change, but also highlighting some of the sustainable practices and decisions that have been made for a long time.
That's great. And what do you think was the most interesting thing you found about those practices?
I think, the most interesting thing was that they were there, and we have, suppose in where we are now, we kind of ignore quite a lot of it, and many times repackage it as this sustainable thing. But I was very surprised to learn a lot of what had been done before that we're continuing to do now, and almost needing to do it a lot more. For protection of the environment. And so, that was really one of the eye-opening things for me, was just to recognize how many cultures and traditional practices were there, that if we were thinking along those terms, we would have cut sustainable or environmentally friendly and such.
Yeah, that sounds really important. And I know Black and Green is continuing now, and there's new ambassadors. So do you get involved with training them and telling them about your experiences, or do they just kind of start fresh and set their own agendas for what they'd like to do?
No, absolutely. I get involved with the new ambassadors. We had a workshop yesterday, a kind of writing and storytelling workshop to kind of help them along in telling their story. So, and you ask if I am training them, but we get training from other organizations such as your own. We start with hearing from the University of Bristol. We spoke to Policy Bristol. We spoke to the Cabot Institute, which is a science organization. So we were able, as ourselves, not scientists, but needing to understand that to be able to follow the discussions, right? And so it's a great project in that it's rounded, and it brings us from our home communities, what's happening on the ground, but also connects us with how that fits into policy change and what happens at, big picture, while we're the kind of small groups that feed into that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think community knowledge is so important, and including voices, from all sectors of society, and especially those that are often silenced or not listened to, or ignored. So I think Black and Green is such an incredible project. It's nice to hear that you've been working with the Cabot Institute as well. Although I would say it's also social scientists, not just scientists at the Cabot Institute.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I think the Cabot Institute is very careful to try and include social science as well, and history and art and everything, because climate change is such a complex issue. You need all these different kinds of perspectives and scholars working in different areas to understand it.
Right, absolutely. And I think, I mentioned the scientist because that's what I don't have. So I'm a bit of a social scientist myself in terms of my work previous to kind of getting involved in this part of advocacy. And so what the Cabot Institute has offered I think for me it was it really was understanding what is like net zero. It really was understanding that type of big picture thing that at some point I think we are trying to feed into. But you're absolutely right. I think some of the other things that the Cabot Institute has done, I mean, in terms of the murals that have come out of their conversations about uncertainty, and the conversations that come through other other media, other mediums of things, it's definitely how I think the messaging has to be anyways, if we're trying to get people across all walks of life, all interests involved and interested or advocating for climate protections.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think, conversations I've had with scientists who I've been able to meet because of the Cabot Institute, which create networks between people working on different areas of climate change. But what I found talking to them was that they're frustrated because they think, we have the evidence. Like, why is nothing happening? And that's where, research about policy comes in. That's where art comes in. That's where like research on social movements comes in, history, all this stuff, to understand how humans operate and what affects their decision making. And also like what historical ties we have to one another and how that might influence global policy, even looking at colonialism and how that's affected relationships between the global north and the global south, and erased voices and created, inequality, not just in terms of climate justice, but so many inequalities around the world. So I think it's more and more appreciated that we need different voices and different perspectives to understand climate justice, to understand climate policy, to understand decision making. So I find that all of a sudden, after 10 years of studying climate justice, it's become interesting and exciting in public, with school children running around chanting, "We want climate justice now." I mean, it's incredible. So I feel very happy that all of a sudden thinking about justice is valuable to society and not just to my small academic bubble of other climate justice scholars, so that is so rewarding.
Right. I mean, I would add that in terms of advocating for the environment from also in minority groups, it was a fringe thing as well, but it was always there. So, I would say like I grew up in Jamaica, and growing up in Jamaica, we're outdoors all the time. We're very close to the environment, so we have a certain kind of connection and understanding of it. We would have always had, or we would have grown up knowing that Rastafarians are kind of like stewards of nature and are always advocating for nature and for environmental practices or living close to the earth or environmental justice. And now that a lot of this is mainstream, I think one of the things I'm a bit bitter about is that we forget that these were actually, a lot of these communities were already considering these things. We might not have had the names, sustainable practice, climate policy. We might not have had the names, but we had the connection to the earth or the sea or whatever it was, the farm, whatever it was that we were involved in. And we're forgetting that a lot of the knowledge is held, and we're not going into those places for the knowledge.
I agree. I think, there's some very striking statistics about indigenous populations and the amount of land they actually protect around the world and how important that protection is and their knowledge is and the history of that area and how much they know about it. And it is such a shame and a real hindrance, I think, to climate policy to not include those voices and ask them, what can we do to protect nature? And I agree. I think, these voices have been there for centuries and know a lot about how to use land properly and to be in tune with nature and to respect nature, more than we do in these mainstream, mainly Western decision-making platforms. So yeah, I completely agree with you. So what do you think about Bristol then as a city? Do you think it's like a unique place to be working in this space? Do you think there's something kind of special about Bristol?
Bristol is, I think it's definitely a special place for me because of that kind of energy. Bristol likes to tantalize, I suppose. Bristol likes to kind of agitate. And I don't mean it in any way like antagonistic, but I think you have to be critical of things that happened before we recognize that actually we might be able to do better than that. And I think Bristol is a place where that happens. And so I love the city, and I almost, once I moved to Bristol, it was almost impossible for me to not get involved somehow in some kind of community something, just because it was there and open, and I had a bit of an interest, a bit of a skill. I tried it, it worked, and I've stuck with it. And I think that's another thing with Bristol, is that people get involved with things, and they stick it out. Again, I don't know if that's the camaraderie or just the energy in the city, but when I came to Bristol, about 6 years ago, I remember the campaign for the reparations motion to be called, for the city council to call that. There should be an inquiry into Bristol's involvement in the slave trade. And last week there was a council approval of that. So I think it's a place where you actually see results. And same thing with declaring a climate emergency. I think Bristol is a place that just set the trend in a way. Bristol sets the trends.
Yeah, I totally agree. I came to Bristol in 2015, but I just fell in love with the city and the university. And I had the same, I got the same vibe, that this was like a city full of energy, full of impetus. So I guess one question we were going to talk about is, what are the kind of challenges in your research area, or in the area of, I guess, climate advocacy?
The one thing that community groups is always going to face problems with is funding, and not necessarily always getting the funding, but even knowing the processes of writing those bids is a real problem for, I think, a lot of community organizations, is when we're talking about just getting the admin bit done. Same thing for like training programs. We have a lot of training programs, but when people leave those training programs, we don't have anything to help them get into the industry, or the corporate part of this kind of work that is not necessarily anything to do with the environment, but it is about how we organize to protect the environment or our spaces. But our challenges as well is also because, as I said before, a lot of the ideas of sustainability and justice, environmental justice, that might come from my community, and I'm a Caribbean woman, might come from Indian communities, South Asian communities, or African communities that are here. They will not be considered straight off the bat sustainable. They don't come in line with what we see as good climate policy in the global north, right? So I think those connections are probably another big problem, is that we're not especially not learning from the global south. And I think that's a huge problem when we come to talk about solutions and policy, and what we on our side in the global north have to be doing, because again, it's just one world, and so I think on the ground in Bristol with the Black and Green Project, which is just about us here in Bristol, our challenges have been trying to show why that stuff is important to us in the city, understand things are connected. So when we start seeing fires in the Amazon just raging, why is it we need to understand that for some of the things we eat here, some of the products we get, so it's, for me, I think getting those connections on both sides, in communities and on the end of the corporate people, the policymakers, third sector, quite often is hard because there's not direct impact or result in our work for Bristolians in that sense.
I've just started my project, and I'm interviewing people from these like smaller organizations in Bristol. And I think what I'm hearing is that there's just such a complexity to what's going on, even just in a city, like if you want to make a decision about cycle lanes, like where do you go? Who's responsible for that? How do you get the council to listen? Like who's on the transport board, So it's really, really interesting that decision making is just never straightforward, whatever level you're operating at. And that's dangerous with climate change, because we need good decisions, just decisions, quick decisions, and that's just not really able to happen at the minute. So I think that's been one of the things I find interesting in observing decision making as well. I feel like people are a bit cautious to be radical. If we look at the COP process, for example, so the Conference of the Parties, who've been meeting since the 90s every year to discuss climate action, like the results of those discussions and the global frameworks that are created are so vague, and they're not radical at all, you know? Like, yeah, it might be kind of radical to say, let's limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees, but then the actual plans that come out from individual countries are nowhere near that. You know, we're heading towards 3, maybe 4 degrees at the moment. So what I found in my research is that like radical decision-making among state actors is really rare. It's probably because voices that are radical are trampled over and ignored. Communities are ignored, like you said, you know, voices from the global south, voices from indigenous communities. For example, if you look at how the Paris Agreement was formulated, before it was, you know, whatever, how many pages it is, 15, 16 pages, it was 88 pages long when they went into the COP to decide, you know, what the Paris Agreement would look like. And then line by line, they went through all the options. And what you see happening in those discussions is that like the more radical options, you know, for example, let's make a list of countries that are responsible for paying for climate change, and like, you know, let's write it down. That just gets erased and isn't part of the Paris Agreement in the end. Yeah, decision making around climate change, man, it is tough to study and to research. And you know, with the COP coming up now in the UK, COP26, I'm curious to see A, whether it goes ahead, and B, what they're gonna do, whether there's going to be any kind of interesting radical change. So there's some different like aspects that they're focusing on this year, like nature-based solutions, adaptation and resilience, green finance, clean energy and transport. All of that's really important, but I'm just like very much looking to them to shift something in how we react to climate change and what we're doing, because it's just not good enough at the moment.
I think you're right in that, you know, we don't hear the voices. And again, I would say that a lot of the voices probably are there. They are not heard. And that might be with, as you said, they're so focused on doing the work that there's not enough of anything to then go and write an article or put it out there that they're doing it. So I think there are lots of people and groups that are working like that. And we don't hear about a lot of these small things. I didn't until I started doing some of my own work and became connected with other groups like Emaila working in Bristol, Tribe of Doris working in Bristol, who have either nature-based programs or are working directly, you know, under the same lines that we're working with on Black and Green. Those networks are so important. Policymakers and people at the top need to be there and actually see things happening as they go along, and not just sitting in offices and a bit disconnected, you know, and I know that's hard, but I really think, as you say, it would take a lot of radical change for these voices to be heard. And I don't, you know, as much as we're doing with Black and Green, we're also now on the part where you can Google us, and so we're going to be the top hit, so you're going to call us and not go and look often for anyone else, right? So I think we as a group have a responsibility to show that there's a wider network of people doing this sort of work. But policymakers and the decision makers also have to be interested enough to come to us, to come into those communities, to come on the smallest level that you can get to of where these decisions are made, which is families and communities.
I think I've seen two shifts. One is this non-state response to climate change, you know, the kind of energy that there exists on the city level, on the community level, and even with, you know, like people working together around the world, kind of acknowledging that the states are failing us in their decision making at the global level, and that it's not enough, and it's not good enough, and it's not fast enough, and it's not radical enough. So my kind of interest lies now in this non-state response. And then the second thing is like, just as a climate justice scholar, to see the space, I don't know, for my work and my interests opening up. So for example, like climate scientists wanting to know about justice, people in the community in Bristol turning up to talks about climate justice and, you know, why it matters to think about philosophy and responsibility and fairness and questions like that. So that's really cool. Like the city, the university, the Cabot Institute, like all of a sudden people care about justice and thinking about what that actually means. So I think that's great. Both of those things give me a lot of hope. And I think part of the solution to climate change is, like you said, including more voices, including ideas, and including actors that are not big states at the COP making decisions. Is there anything else you wanted to ask or to talk about?
I actually wanted to ask you, as coming, from the academy too, because I suppose this is also one of the criticisms that we have, that the academics are also disconnected from what it is that happens in communities. So I'm kind of interested in yourself as an educator and your consideration of things like this.
So I think, it's complicated because academics have all these metrics that they're judged by, like a research output, how good of a teacher you are, whether you're a good academic citizen and you're doing your admin work. But like public engagement and engaging with real people, and communities is only just starting to be valued at the university. So I think that's the challenge, to get academics to see the value in it, the value in speaking to people in their community, sharing their knowledge, but also listening to what the community has to say. I've certainly learned a lot by engaging with members of the community in Bristol. They have amazing questions about justice and, really get me to think. And I'm so grateful for them to even, turn up and ask questions. It's brilliant. But and it won't surprise you that a lot of these events that I do, where everyone in Bristol is invited technically, it's a lot of middle class white faces in the audience, and I think as academics we're maybe seen as like uninteresting or snobby or like wanting to exclude people and not wanting to see certain people. So I think this image of academics as kind of separated from the community, that really needs to change. And I think academics need to work on showing that that's not true. And I want, in my events that I hold anyway, for people to feel like they can be there and it's safe and, they're valued.
So I operate in both worlds, I suppose, because I'm still an academic for now and working with community groups as well. And I know it sounds so simple, it sounds so kind of like basic, but it really is about possibly finding one group, one person, and working from there, hoping to get the snowball effect. That has worked for us in terms of when we kind of get a one group or one person or one organization, and we've sustained work with them over a few years. And I found that has been better for us than if we have 4 or 5 organizations who are interested, or we are interested in them, and we do a one-off project. We get much more value, I think, on both sides if we have a much more prolonged thing. So I think academics and also, other organizations who are working with, who would like to work with communities, probably shouldn't be thinking too big, because I think you start getting into it and then it snowballs after a while.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm hoping through my new project where I'm meeting smaller scale groups that I can form some new relationships instead of just sitting in my ivory tower.
Well, yeah, because I think those relationships are important, especially when talking to, people who have been left out before, people that we call the minorities or disadvantaged, is that there's been so much research that these communities already, they have research fatigue and also just mistrust, because quite often the research has been done and they never hear back what happens. The policy might have been implemented, but they actually themselves might not know the process and know that this new law or policy, they fed into it. So that's why that relationship is important, because I think we have to be going back and saying, look, thank you for what you did. Here's the result of it. It might take 3 years. This is how this thing works, right? Because we want quick results.
Thank you. That's really helpful. What message do you want to share with policymakers?
Policymakers need to get uncomfortable. Don't be afraid to get uncomfortable and learn the things from the people you represent. I really think flipping that power thing on the head is really a good way. So for example, in Bristol, we asked our people at the top to go to a community meeting of an immigrant group where they don't speak the language. So they are the one who doesn't understand. And so I think getting uncomfortable a little bit is a great way to think from other people's position.
My message to policymakers is stop the vague rhetoric around justice and do the work. You know, it's one thing to promise to take human rights into account or protect future generations in these policy documents, and it's another to really do that dirty work and implement systemic change and be radical and really rethink how we approach climate change, because what we've been doing for the past 30 years isn't working. Incremental change is not enough. We need systemic change at every level of society, and as a policymaker, it's your job to figure out how to do that and not just say you're going to.